In this part, the Labor Party has put forward a number of amendments, and briefly to deal with those, they deal with Clause 5, inserting a manifestly unjust provision for the sentencing of a third strike, excluding in Clause 5, Section 86A, excluding accidental or and negligent manslaughter for some of the reasons. I'll go into it later in the debate that my colleague has said, and there are a number of other amendments. But could I just make a couple of points? What I think is interesting about the process around this bill as we talk about Part 1 is that if the Minister made a comment in her summation, I think she said, and I'll be corrected if I misquote her, that she doesn't consider offenders to be victims. And to some extent I agree with her on that. But it's very interesting that if you accept, as for instance Mr Garrett did, when he got into some difficulties in this place in his own office, yes, I am talking about Part 1. If you listen, you're not chairing the trouble with that member is she's not chairing the Law and Order Select Committee now. We've got a decent chairman in the chair. And when Mr Garrett got into some difficulties, he said a couple of things. He said, hang on, things happen in my life. I think he referred to an oil rig. I think he referred to a culture in Samoa that he said affected his behaviour at the present time. And I accept that. And I don't argue with that. And I don't actually say it to make a political point, because I think what Mr Garrett was actually saying was things happen in people's lives. For instance, the child who was raped at the age of 5 by his father may indeed turn out to be the sexual predator at age 25, and that does not excuse in any way what that sexual predator did. But logically one might say, as actually the alibi Mr Garrett used for his own behaviour, that the environment that you grew up in, the things that were done to you, do not excuse your behaviour, but may have some tangible or intangible intelligent connection that may have promoted you to becoming that predator that you are today. Maybe there's a connection. I agree with the people who say that doesn't excuse the behaviour. I agree with the people who say that that does not excuse the behaviour, but I would argue that there is a connection. And if there is a connection, to use Mr Garrett's point about starting points, that's a starting point perhaps that we should be dealing with, not simply political pamphlets like this. So whilst I agree with the Minister when I say, offenders, because of the nature of their actions, aren't necessarily victims, if one looked at their behaviour and their environment that they grew up in, and they were in the environment that they lived in, one might be able to draw some tangible conclusions that might teach us ways that we could prevent crime from happening in the future. Now, to get back to stop the squawk box across the aisle over there, to get back, who still thinks she's chairing the Law and Order Committee, and chaired it in such a way where she truncated and shut down any debate about the process of surrounding this bill. And if she thought that this bill was really going to work, she would have encouraged debate, sir. She would have allowed the Justice Ministry, the actual authoritative agency that deals with this bill, to actually submit on the amending clauses. And the Minister of Justice, who's become an invisible man, I don't blame him in some ways, actually, because he doesn't believe in it either. But if we deal, sir, with some of the amendments we've put forward, we're putting forward an amendment to Clause 5, a new Section 86D, to amend subsection 2. I'll go slowly for Ms Gowdy. By inserting after maximum term of imprisonment prescribed for each offence, unless the court is satisfied that given the circumstances of the offence and the offender, it would be manifestly unjust to make the order. Now, the reason for this is because the legislation says that on a third strike, the offender will receive the maximum penalty in prison for that offence with no parole. When people have criticised the bill for taking away judicial discretion, the ACT Party has repeatedly asserted that the court has the discretion on a third qualifying offence to not impose the maximum sentence if it would be manifestly unjust. For example, Mr Hyde and Mr Garrett, in a pamphlet, 3 Strikes Policy, the Sentencing Parole Bill, said the following, quote, "The judge sentencing a strike 3 offender will have no option but to sentence the offender to the maximum sentence. The only exception is if the judge determines it would be manifestly unjust to do so." Now, this is not correct. The proposed legislation says that although the court, Mr Chair...
Honourable Clayton-Cosgrove.
Thank you, sir. The proposed legislation says that although the court has the discretion not to order the sentence to be served without parole, if it is satisfied that it would be manifestly unjust to make the order, imposing the maximum sentence on a third qualifying offence is mandatory. Now, simply put, the amendment gives the court the discretion not to impose a maximum term of imprisonment on a third strike offence if it is satisfied that it would be manifestly unjust to do so. That aligns the proposed legislation with the public assertions, at least, of the ACT Party. And there are many examples of where it may be deemed unjust to sentence an offender to a maximum sentence for a third offence. The most obvious, of course, has been discussed in the previous debate, being manslaughter, because of the huge variances in the seriousness of that offence. As the legislation is currently written, an offender would receive a life sentence for manslaughter on a third offence, whether the manslaughter was a vicious assault or a tragic hunting accident. In fact, we had officials who came before us and said it was the case, and could well be the case, not theoretically but in practical terms, that a person may commit a heinous first strike offence and get a lesser sentence than a person who commits a third strike and less heinous, if I can put it that way, offence. And I wonder what the minister, the Get Tough minister, and Mr Garrett will say to those victims, the victim of that first strike offence, when they compare the two and they say, hang on, something's wrong here, if we are talking about equity of victims. And what emotions will run through those victims' minds. And I say again, if we are actually interested in justice and appropriate levels of justice, then issues around manslaughter and the varying nature of it should be, and indeed should be, considered. Because you could have the case, of course, where a person commits aggravated robbery twice, say, to finance a drug habit. Not making any excuses for them, extremely bad thing to do, outrageous, should be punished. But 40 years on, of course, when they may have cleaned up their act, because one would hope that we all believe in that thing called hope and maybe reintegration, that after 40 years of non-offending, they go out with their mate, I'm sure somebody will laugh at this, and a hunting accident occurs and somebody is killed. That is a real possibility. May be remote, but it is a possibility that needs to be covered off in this legislation, and we have an amendment dealing with that as well on the table. So it's not about political points. There are some major holes in this legislation. I have no doubt it will go through tonight. We will oppose it. They have the votes, they will win. But we're proposing a number of amendments here because we do believe, even though we oppose it going through, that there are manifest inadequacies and weaknesses within this legislation. And I'd like an explanation from the Minister on my example. A person who commits aggravated robbery, say twice in their career, to say finance a drug habit, then 40 years later they commit a third strike offence because they go hunting with their mate, not excusing it, and something occurs and an accident happens and the third strike kicks in. That, I would argue, is far different from the higher degrees and variances of manslaughter and the vicious nature of manslaughter. I think we can probably all think of a number of examples. But I say in all seriousness to the Minister, she may want to take some advice on that issue, because I think it is a pertinent issue. If we are really truly concerned, as has been said, about protecting victims and also ensuring that just outcomes flow from this legislation. I don't believe they will, but like we have in the past with other law and order bills, we offer the Minister what we believe may well be a logical solution. I'd be very interested tonight, because Mr Garrett is a lawyer, I am not, if he could proffer an opinion on that and perhaps the other amendments that are there. Because even Mr Garrett, we have our disagreements from time to time, I would hope, as I would assume all members of Parliament, would want to pass legislation that at least provides for just outcomes and doesn't perpetuate or create through unintended consequence unjust outcomes. And the hypothetical example that I put before the House, if that was put into practice, I would argue would be an unjust outcome. If you have a person who has cleaned their act up, who maybe has learnt from a first and a second strike, maybe, and then we have the hunting accident, the person who is killed. and they receive under this legislation, I would argue, in its present form, a manifestly